Yes, the session we've been asked to talk about is sponsorship by numbers. Contrary to what Andrew says, I don't have a huge fascination for them. I'm more interested in how this associative marketing communication world actually sort of performs. And so it's really my pleasure to introduce this final session. So let's crack on with it. The three things that I'm going to talk about, which hopefully are in line with what you're expecting, are these. Specifically, I'm going to focus on the use of large numbers which are used to quantify and justify the performance of sponsorship, and which really try to understand. What we're going to try to do is understand the real returns from those. We're going to look at the maybe original matrix or model for using sponsorship and how it was meant to communicate and was measured. And we're going to look at a new matrix and model which is hopefully more based on the key drivers of this communication. It's interesting to me that we have to get to the final session to talk about measurement and evaluation. It's usually the case at conferences, which sort of implies that it's the final part of the process. When in fact, if you can't clearly articulate your measurement and evaluation criteria right from the outset, it may imply that you are not clear in terms of your objectives and targets. And if that is the case, then it's hard to see how you will devise the right strategy to achieve any outcomes. In this way, this sort of reflects the way that the industry has viewed measurement and evaluation, often an afterthought, always a way of trying to justify the expenditure to the board. And it is this need to justify, originally, the cost of rights, and then the return on investment that led to the focus on the numbers, which is what we're to talk about, and particularly the comparison with advertising value. Numbers really don't get much bigger than those that are associated with the Football World Cup. It's an event that's broadcast to about 196 countries, or 200 and something, subject to how many countries there are in the world. It's an event that attracts vast TV audiences. This figure here of 5.5 billion viewers comes from the live matches in just 25 markets. So these first two stats convey a sort of sense of scale for the World Cup. The next two are much more about the sponsors' outputs. The first of these would imply that sponsors at the 2010 FIFA World Cup achieved 370,000 seconds of branding, which is equivalent to about 4 days of continuous branding, made up of boards and backdrops, which in some cases only the sophisticated imaging recognition software can actually pick up. And this generated a staggering $17.7 billion worth of media value, or when factored down by methodologies that have never been really correlated to impact, is around about $4.1 billion. Vast numbers. The larger of those two is similar to the GDP of Estonia or Paraguay. Even factored down, it's a huge number and would almost certainly keep most marketing departments happy. However, we believe that these advertising equivalent values are nonsense and bear little relation to the likely impact that's achieved through these activities. I find it sort of depressing but not surprising that according to the pre-conference survey, 70% of sponsors still rate media value as one of the most important criteria. But, you know, I've been a bit negative about numbers, but they do have their place, and they're an essential part of the pre-assessment, pre-evaluation planning process. We must consider interest levels, demographics, likely audience outputs, etc. And even those referred to on the previous chart, probably excluding advertising value equivalents, can be of value. They can provide a sense of scale or scope for an event or activity. They can be used to benchmark one's activity versus another, or one year's activity versus a previous year's activities. They allow us to measure how we're doing in relationship to other sponsors, and if undertaken properly, can provide valuable audience efficiency and effectiveness data. But really what we're looking at here are outputs. And a note of caution really, just because something's there is absolutely no guarantee that we will notice it or understand it. So, what I'd like to do now is to show you a short video. Some of you may have seen something like this, or maybe this actual video before. If you have, please bear with me, as I believe it makes an important and hopefully interesting point. So, can you run the video, please?
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game?
So, I wonder how many of you spotted the gorilla, the curtain changing colour, and the player leaving. I have seen the original video, but I still didn't spot the fact that the curtain changed colour. But then, you know, why would I? Because the curtain changing colour was in the background of the activity that was taking place. This video was originally produced in 1999, or at least an earlier iteration of it, by Charles Chabrias and Daniel Simons, as part of the research they undertook into how the human mind works. This research ultimately led them towards an Ig Nobel Prize for Psychology in 2004. So it's sort of fairly pucker stuff. Originally they circulated the video to Harvard students and found that 50% didn't see the gorilla. They then tested this amongst much more robust but maybe less intelligent samples, and it delivered exactly the same result, consistently, time and time again. It's surprising that only 50% see the gorilla, when it's very much in the foreground, or as an old boss of mine used to say, very much at the heart of the action. It proves that we don't always see what we're looking at. It's because the brain's supervisory attentioning system filters out what's not relevant to us, and in this case, we were asked to count the number of passes from the white players. So those concentrating hard wouldn't have spotted the gorilla. It's also because the brain is only capable of effectively focusing 100% of its attention on one thing at a time, something my wife reminds me of constantly. It's interesting if we start thinking about the use of social media whilst we're watching football, for example, whilst it's on television, and how much more that distracts us from maybe what's in the periphery of what we're seeing. Another example of the mind focusing attention, which I'm sure we've all experienced ourselves. So when we're driving a car, maybe along a motorway, having a conversation with somebody in the passenger seat, and we decide to make an overtaking manoeuvre. We check the rear view mirror, we look in the side mirror, and we decide if it's safe to overtake, and we execute the manoeuvre. Whilst we do this, we almost always stop talking. And we stop talking because the brain is telling us to give 100% of our concentration on a manoeuvre which is potentially dangerous. The more observant passengers will also stop talking to allow us to focus our attention on making that manoeuvre. I think what this video and research demonstrates to us is that just because something's there doesn't mean we will see it. And in sponsorship terms, just because we've seen some branding, or at least it's been on screen, don't expect the audience to notice it, and don't rely upon those large output numbers as an indicator of value or impact. So I think the message at this stage is that we definitely shouldn't confuse outputs with outcomes. They're completely different, and any assumption that there is a direct correlation between the two is a likely indicator of a lack of understanding of how the sponsorship process works. And this might mean, ultimately, that the objectives that have been set for the activity are flawed or maybe misguided. 10 years ago, the former president of marketing at Coca-Cola said, "Presence is easy, impact is hard." Words that are completely relevant still today, and probably more so when we have a proliferation of different media outlets to communicate. So let's go back to the FIFA World Cup for a second and take a look at some additional numbers from the 2010 competition. These have been supplied to me by a sponsor, and that sponsor achieved about 34,000 seconds worth of exposure of branding for their company's name, and an advertising equivalent value of 1.6 billion or 370 million factored down. 370 million is a large number, and it's very similar to the amount that P&G spent on advertising in the UK in 2011 across all of their brands. So it's an indicator of how much impact they should have achieved for this. So, in terms of outcomes, I know that you're all expecting me to click the button again and see how effectively or not a sponsor's program actually worked, but clearly with the need to keep confidentiality, I can say that in only one of a number of markets, and all football markets that were important as part of their program, did the brand achieve a significant increase in association with the FIFA World Cup, despite the supposed $370 million worth of value. And this increase was amongst people who are claiming to be followers of football. But it's likely that this increase was as a result of a Through the Line campaign that they run, which wasn't run in the other markets. So maybe the sponsor or their agency made some assumptions based on an old model, which may go something a little like this. And I'm sure actually nobody in this room would use this these days. But I think it's worth reminding us of where we all sort of came from. The old model assumes that the audience of the event or activity see the branding. Very simple. They become aware of the brand's involvement, and this improves the awareness of the brand, and some form of image halo from the event is transferred onto the brand. Okay, so I know that's old thinking, but you will be surprised. This model, which is simplistic and makes too many assumptions about what we see, understand, and how we react to it, it also assumes that all sponsors are similar, no matter what category they're from, whether there is any emotional or rational connection or link to the event or activity, and takes no account at all of existing memories of the brand or associated with that particular event. Measurement was more designed to justify the investment, as I sort of indicated just now, rather than understand returns. Hence, we were looking at cumulative audiences, we were tracking awareness, comparing aware versus not aware, and comparing aware versus not aware of the sponsorship will always produce a positive awareness or image outcome. It's because those aware of a brand's communications will almost certainly be closer or more committed to that brand in the first instance. This measurement process is a little like a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. If we were to look at a slightly newer model, what we need to be trying to do is to accurately reflect the sort of key drivers of sponsorship communication activities. As such, we should recognize that the activity's audience is made up of people with different levels of emotional and rational connections to the activity. And some recent fanship work that we've done would indicate that only 7% of the adult population are truly emotionally and rationally committed to a Premier League football club. There are many more supporters and followers of clubs, and they have much lower levels of emotional connection. And this has a direct bearing on their ability to recall and understand sponsors' association with those clubs, regardless of the age and socioeconomic groupings that they might fall into. we must sort of remember that not all fans are the same. We have to get the audience's attention, which is tough given the supervisory attention system's ability to filter out what's not relevant to us or indeed not interesting to us. We have to build an understandable association between the brand and activity, drawing on existing memories of each, and we need to meaningfully engage the audience. And obviously we've had lots of conversation about engaging via social media. If we can do this, then we stand a chance of building likability for the brand and building on existing brand memories, and therefore have a chance to improve the existing commitment that the audience has for the brand. Measurement and evaluation and really planning should focus on the key drivers of sponsorship, which we certainly see as relevance and connection at a pre-assessment phase as well as ongoing and post the activity. This focus allows us to fully understand the impact of on the brand and community, and importantly to identify what actions are required to improve performance moving forward. Relevance is very important. It's the hook to getting notice and building people's attention, and aspects of sponsorship that are there that can build relevance includes the level of property equity, target audience fanship status, communications appeal, as well as the more traditional exposure and visibility. Once we've got their attention, moving to engagement requires the connection between the brand and the activity. Key aspects of building a positive connection include activity rationale, emotional or rational, appropriateness of the link, balance between patronage and commercial, program content and messaging. All these affect the ability to strengthen the connection and engage the audience. And we've heard much about the need to have good content in communications. Equally, it's important that we don't disconnect through the audiences. And we can do this through poor or confusing links, intrusive or annoying activity, an assumption that the audience actually wants to have some sort of relationship with a commercial organisation, too much clutter. And this is a particular bugbear of mine, and it's not the strongest of these four. The strange use of odd end lines, such as one I heard just the other day in the car, which was for a motor dealer that said, XYZ motor dealer are proud to sponsor Eagle Radio's website, which to my mind seems rather strange. So really finally, I hope I've answered the points that I've been asked to address, and I would like you to take away three sort of simple messages. Firstly, only use numbers to inform and not as a means to justify. Secondly, don't confuse outputs with outcomes. There's usually little correlation between the two. And consider focusing on fanship, relevance, and connection when we plan and evaluate activities. Thank you.
Do you find that they're asking you to help them measure the right things? Do you advise them on different things that they could be measuring? Or do they come to you with a short list and you say, yes, certainly, I'll measure that for you?
They sort of do a mixture of all three, unfortunately. Often we are asked to, well, I mean, the way we would normally work is that we would try to understand what the client's trying to achieve, and we would recommend to them the best way of constructing an evaluation program. Sometimes that might be that they are saying, well, we really need to have X, Y, or Z. And we would point out the strengths and the weaknesses of that particular sort of approach and reach an agreement. It's not going to be a boxing match, obviously. But
And there are very much more subjective measures, of course, as well, that we might attach to the appropriateness or indeed to justify an association. Yes. Max, if I may, if I can come to you now. You've been studying and looking into the role of business in society, and I know that you've been working very closely with a sponsor of the Olympic Games, Coca-Cola. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the recommendations and stances that perhaps you've been mindful of, that you've been considering, rather than simply looking at, an advertising equivalent value, for example?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be able to tell you anything whatsoever about advertising equivalent value because that's not what I am. I'm not a marketeer, and so I'm woefully underinformed about the excellent and incredibly scientific work you all do. What we're interested in at Demos is looking at the social value that is generated by certain forms of sponsorship and sponsorship activation. And we're working, as you mentioned, we're working with Coca-Cola to pilot their 2012 sponsorship through a new measure that we've developed that's designed to try and capture some of that. And I suppose it was really interesting watching your presentation, and you were saying about missing things that are clearly there because it's not what you're focusing on, because it's probably not what your board is asking you to justify. And I think that a huge thing that is often missing from the way in which brands and corporates understand the value of their sponsorship is social value, and that's understandable because you're not charities and that's not necessarily your purpose or your job. But in terms of justifying sponsorship, and we've in the run-up to 2012, experienced a lot of calls for people to justify their role in sponsoring various things. In terms of justifying a sponsorship, in terms of explaining exactly the kind of positive impressions people ought to have of your brand, actually getting a really good understanding of what social value might be being added through the work you're doing is really important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Alex, if I may come to you. We've heard a lot about the way in which numbers can be used, and we've talked about justification, vindication. But from your point of view, and indeed we were chatting just a little bit earlier about your association with Hornby, with the London 2012 Olympic Games, you've been very concerned and interested in the way in which some of these metrics can guide you in the future.
Yeah. I would agree wholeheartedly with the panel on that. You generally have to use numbers to justify anything that you want to try and do. And, as a person who's in a position of influence to that board of directors, to get the nod and the yes and the gatekeepers to the money, you have to do the numbers work. I think the key thing I picked up out from what Ian said is not to let that sort of amend your focus.
Mm-hmm.
So that does a job. And then you move on and you realign exactly what you intend to achieve. And, we, as I said in my talk earlier, the social media aspect of 2012 and the conversations that go on is probably the part that we have been most interested in tracking and monitoring and measuring. And we're working now with an organisation that's completely new to us, but they literally monitor everything that gets said about London 2012 generally, about Hornby in relation to that, who is saying it, what they're saying, the sentiment, the message, how that's associated with your business and your brand, if it changes throughout a campaign, if something happens in the London 2012 arena, does it have a negative or positive impact on you as a business, where the main influencing commentators are, if there are various websites or blog spaces that's prompting, so that we can use that data to have a legacy beyond 2012, to re-engage and talk to those people.
And also, I would assume, to be able to make course corrections mid-campaign.
Yeah, definitely. And also, up against, they can monitor your competition at the same time. So, is what you are doing having effect on what is happening to your competitors? Is it having no effect whatsoever? Do you actually then go back to the numbers and say, you know what, actually what I intended to see here? So maybe they run in parallel. But I think they should definitely not take over the focus of the real reason for doing it. They're a perfect gatekeeper and they're a great place to start to get the nod to do the activity. But definitely shouldn't cloud your judgment on the next steps that you take.
Okay,
so.
thank you. If I can bring in Simon. Simon, you are the author of eminent reports and specialist areas. You take very much a macro view. Could you give us some thoughts and ideas on how you approach reporting on things that have happened in the past and how you might use that to indicate what sponsors, brands, rights holders might be or should be considering going forward into the future?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of the, I think, the interesting areas is perhaps what rights holders can do to present their case to sponsors. Ian had said earlier that we shouldn't focus on media, and we find that when we talk to sponsors, but there's a lot of rights holders still think this is the data that they should be giving. But as an interesting example we were involved in was a second division football club asked us to do some research for for them to present a package to potential sponsors. And we did the media evaluation, we did focus group, which was very interesting. But we also did socio-demographic research, and that proved to be the most useful to them because they could, for example, they showed they were targeting a consumer electronics brand, and they could show that their fan base was above average propensity to buy those products. They could show the stores, type of store they bought them from, and then we overlaid some GIS mapping, graphical information system mapping, to show fan clusters and the outlets of that particular brand, and they happened to match pretty perfect. And that was presented to the sponsor, potential sponsor, and they went with that club rather than 1-2 divisions above, because they'd actually taken a real interest on what their business objective was.
So club selection was based upon empirical data,
Yeah.
nothing to do with brand fit or anything like that.
Well, it was brand fit because the I mean, in terms of branding of the club, there wasn't a
Mm.
brand fit, but there was a fit between the target audience for the brand
Sure.
and the product, and ultimately, you know, that's what they wanted. They wanted to sell units, you know, on that sort of level, on a smaller scale sponsorship. It's either charity or it is you want to sell units. You're not trying to develop a global brand with a second division, to be honest. So. You know, it's interesting, they weren't really interested in the media value at all. They sort of knew what that would be, and it didn't interest them in that.
Is it the view of the panel that advertising value as a guide towards the success of a sponsorship is now an arcane and indeed archaic measure?
Adam Mangan first. I don't think it's archaic, no. I think it needs to be taken in context with a multitude of objectives that you're trying to deliver against. It's a great starting point because it's based on, you know, scientific principles, and you know, it can't really be argued. However, I'm pretty sure most of the marketers in this room are pretty good at making the numbers do exactly what they intend them to do. You know, so as scientific as it is, it's also very creative. I think it has a place for sure. Of moving through the stages of, you know, the ticks in the box and the gatekeeping that needs to go on. And also to make sure that you have actually gone through some sort of thought process.
Sure.
As opposed to just, I'd like to do this, what do you think?
Yeah.
You know, when you have to put the facts in front of people. But I think it's dangerous for it to be the sole
Indeed.
concern.
Ian, I think you wanted to come in on that.
I think I could get emotional about this, but I don't see there really being a place for advertising value in sponsorship. Over 15 years or so of measuring sponsorship activities, I would say that we have seen far more examples where there's no correlation between the value, supposed value, of the media and impact on the brand. If you were to spin those numbers around, and let's use the 370 million, for that you would expect to achieve a substantial result for your brand. And our concern is that sponsors are attracted by the media value and lose sight of really what the potential is for their brand and business.
If I may ask for a quick show of hands, who in the audience, if you represent a brand, still find that this is the primary measure of evaluating sponsorships? And indeed, if you are a rights holder, whether or not advertising value is the thing that you have to prove most often. If I could have a show of hands for those who are still wedded to that particular metric? It's actually surprisingly few, given the...
It would be brave to say yes,
No,
considering
yeah,
the
I
assault,
was going to say.
the assault delivered on it. But yeah,
Are we in danger of being deluged by too much information? I mean, we're advised to measure. We're advised to look at the sort of the minutiae of each campaign in order that we can make course corrections, for example. But then, of course, we have to have surely the right systems in place in order to do something with it.
Absolutely. There's almost no point doing any evaluation work if you're not going to act on the results, and those results, generally speaking, are not quite so valuable after the event. As Alex was saying, you do need to have a program of evaluation which starts pre the activity, and runs during it. And you need to be able to respond to the information that you're receiving so that you can improve the activity as you go along.
Max, you were saying a little earlier that about the role of business and society and the recommendations that you've been making to Coca-Cola. But how far out do we have to be considering something as coherent as a study as you've been working on?
Ideally, you start considering it from the moment that you start envisaging a relationship, and I think this is something which certainly, and one of our ambitions around the work that we're doing. Obviously, we approach this from a public policy point of view, but our ambition is to make the tool that we are developing usable by people in house. We have no interest in kind of going and doing it for people, and on that basis, we've been kind of talking about what some of the best practices around this, and I think this was absolutely brought out in the presentation. You need to be thinking about how you're going to evaluate whatever it is you're going to be measuring right from the start, and starting to think about it halfway through or towards the end or at the very end, which is something that very often happens in a kind of social value world, where you do something, you throw a lot of money at something, and then you think, oh, well, maybe this will also have had a positive impact on self-esteem amongst the young people involved, etc., and you go and measure that at the end. It's already too late. So your data is already going to be fairly crap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. If I may ask, do we have any questions in the audience for the panel on this subject? Yes, gentleman there.
Mike O'Shea, Story. The company that spent, or that got $370 million worth of media value, how much did they spend to get that? And in an efficient market, would not the two be pretty close?
Well, I mean, obviously I can't tell you exactly what they spent on it because that would be breaching any sort of client confidentiality. But I would think that a sponsor of the World Cup, and I'm sure William can sort of...
$40 million per...
It's going to be $50-ish million, I would have thought, 40, 50 million.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be 360.
That
And,
would just be for the rights, not the
and then they would have, there would have been an amplification budget on top of that as well.
So that rather proves your point then. So I mean, because if the market value of it was anything approaching what the claim is, then yeah.
Yeah, and I think we need to look at it from an opportunity cost point of view, which is why, what would you get for the money? The 370.
And gentleman in the middle of the audience there.
Thank you. Andy Kowalczyk, Sports Risk. Isn't this just, though, I mean, for the advertising industry, isn't it the same? I mean, they can't really prove that what they're doing from an advertising point of view is really impacting. You look at, spending a fortune on advertising, buying a cost per thousand, but it's not really actually leading to a sale. It's, you're putting an ad out, which and then you're paying for eyeballs. You're not actually paying for consideration. You're not paying for loyalty. You're not paying for the people buying the brand. So, we're kind of getting a lot wrapped into sponsorship and probably giving sponsorship a hard time in measurement. But I see the same things in advertising world as well. It's very, very difficult to find the holy grail or the panacea to these issues. And it really requires the brands themselves to really work it through to sales. And they need to share that information with you as well to make sure that the measurement is proper.
I think the gentleman makes a very good point. Should we not be thinking about metrics that perhaps are a better indication of engagement, for example, whether somebody actually sort of stepped forward, sat forward, clicked a button, did something in response to what we're doing as a positive reaction to something that we've created?
Oh, completely. And I think we do. I think we've just been focusing on the big numbers here. But it's possible to track people's involvement with social media. It's possible to take people away from that social media environment into a sort of private social media environment and have conversations with them to understand, what they take out from a brand's activity in that particular area. Like advertising, we can look at the entire commitment scale from just being aware of the name through to advocacy. And I think provided we can segment our audiences effectively, we can track over time how people within those different segmentations and how the relationship changes with brands.
You can still have advocacy and brand commitment, but you can still have advocacy of people that like the brand, but they still don't purchase. You can see that on social media, and one of the things that really in digital, the earlier sort of talk, is they're struggling to make a commercial model out of this. you know, and to be able to find the ways of making money or actually selling products
Yeah.
through social media. So it's the same for social media, it's the same for advertising, it's the same for sponsorship.
Well, I mean, I think several points really. I don't think P&G would have the confidence to spend around about 370 million a year in the UK if they didn't think that it was going to affect sales. I'm sure if you talk to anybody within the Kantar companies, they would be able to correlate weights of advertising to sales of particularly FMCG type products. But I do agree with you, within marketing departments there needs to be, and unfortunately I don't have the holy grail because I wouldn't be just concentrating on sponsorship, a way of being able to precisely identify the impact of every pound spent on sales. And it was interesting from Simon's research that sales was the number one objective.
On that particular small global one, I think one of the difficulties in measuring global programs is you can't just stop doing everything else. You know, if you're Coca-Cola and the World Cup comes along, you're not going to say, right, we'll stop all our other marketing activity in the year of the World Cup and just measure any impact. And you've also got to bear in mind the activation budget that you're putting into the World Cup you might normally be using somewhere else as well. So it's difficult to measure purely on sales. I think you've got to really work out what your objectives are, define them carefully and measure on those is ultimately.
Simon, I just want to take one last question from the lady back there in the red. Thank you.
Hello. I think that the other way of looking at it is obviously P&G, it's very top level and we're talking about lots of different products. On a smaller level, we have found that the only way to get people in the media, particularly in bigger glossy magazines, to write about our jewellers and our events is to advertise with them, and they are not interested in talking about the jewellers that we represent or our event unless we advertise. And so in actual fact what we have to do is bring those sponsors with us to add value to that advertising and to make it more attractive for somebody to look at. So we're not just advertising, what we're having to do is to create a whole experience around that advertising, and that actually none of those magazines will engage with us at all unless we do spend money with them. And that relates to, you know, the Evening Standard to Vogue and everything in between. And so that's the challenge for rights or events people, and also for the sponsors that we're working with. And that's something that obviously sometimes those sponsors aren't interested in social media. What they want to do is to see their logo, their brand, the way that they talk about themselves in print and written about subsequently as well. And that's a challenge going forward if you've only got a small budget to work with.
Absolutely. I think it's a challenge for us all. But on that moment, I think note, I think we probably have to leave it. I'd say, Alex, thank you very much indeed. Max, Ian, and Simon, a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.